Speaking out was never part of the contract. Silence was implied long before signatures were signed. The league didn't need to say it openly. The system enforced it naturally. Players learned early what happened to troublemakers. Careers are fragile. Reputations even more so. One interview could change everything. One accusation could close doors permanently. Behind the spectacle, power operated quietly. Former players carried stories they couldn't share. Medical neglect. Broken promises. Unpaid costs. They whispered among themselves. They warned rookies in private. Never on record. Never on camera. Because the NFL controlled access. To teams. To broadcasts. To post-career opportunities. Speaking out meant isolation. Speaking out meant legal attention. Speaking out meant becoming a problem. The league didn't need threats. It had leverage. And leverage is more effective when invisible. Most players chose survival over truth. They had families. Medical bills. Fading relevance. The system rewarded compliance. Silence came with benefits. Noise came with consequences. And so the stories stayed buried. Not because they weren't real, but because telling them was more dangerous than living with them. Before we continue, understand this. What you're about to hear is not part of the official narrative. If you believe former players deserve to be heard, and if you want stories like this told without filters, subscribe to Dark Side of the NFL. This channel exists to question power, challenge silence, and uncover what the league prefers to keep buried. White heavy checkmark non-disclosure agreements became standard armor. Settlements came with conditions. Money exchanged hands quietly. Voices disappeared afterward. Legal language replaced accountability. Every clause carefully designed. Not to heal, but to contain. Players were told it was closure. An ending. But it was erasure. They could not speak publicly. They could not criticize the league. They could not warn others. Breaking silence meant losing everything. Some didn't even read the full documents. They trusted the process. They trusted representatives. They trusted that fairness still existed. What they signed was protection. Not for them. For the league. Silencing didn't require intimidation. It required paperwork. Courts enforced what morality would not. Those who refused settlements faced endless legal battles. Costs piled up. Energy drained. Time disappeared. Most couldn't afford resistance. The league could. So truth became negotiable. Measured in dollars. Bound by signatures. And buried under confidentiality. Publicly, the NFL spoke of care. Privately, it bought silence. And silence proved cheaper than reform ever would be. White heavy checkmark media played its role, willingly or not. Access depended on cooperation. Critical voices lost invitations. Former players who spoke out were labeled unstable, bitter, unreliable. Their credibility attacked first. Their stories questioned second. It wasn't necessary to disprove them, only to discredit them. The league mastered narrative framing. Dissent became drama. Suffering became anecdotal. Patterns were ignored. Executives appeared calm, measured, professional. They spoke in absolutes. Players spoke in pain. Pain rarely wins public debates, especially when reputation is uneven. Networks avoided confrontation. Sponsors avoided controversy. Silence protected revenue, and revenue dictated tone. The league never said, "Don't listen." It simply amplified other voices. Health initiatives, community programs, former stars who smiled on camera. They became proof that everything was fine. Those who weren't fine remained invisible, and invisibility became policy, because the most dangerous truth is the one no one hears. White heavy checkmark retirement did not mean freedom. For many, it meant exposure. Without team protection, players stood alone. Medical support vanished quickly. Phone calls stopped. Resources dried up. What remained were symptoms. Confusion. Pain. Anger without explanation. Some sought help publicly. Others privately. Both faced resistance. The league redirected responsibility. Toward personal choices. Toward lifestyle. Toward genetics. Anything but football. Medical histories were dissected selectively. Personal struggles reframed as causes. The narrative shifted subtly. Suffering became individual failure, not institutional consequence. Former players watched their stories twisted, simplified, dismissed, used against them. Speaking out invited scrutiny. Silence preserved dignity, at least temporarily. Many chose quiet survival. They needed insurance. They needed access to care. They needed peace. Fighting the league meant war without allies. The NFL never raised its voice. It didn't need to. Distance alone was enough. Isolation did the work. And isolation became the most effective silencing tool of all. If this story feels familiar, it's because it keeps repeating. Silence doesn't happen by accident. It's enforced by systems that benefit from it. If you think these voices deserve visibility, leave a like, share this video, and help push these stories beyond controlled narratives. Your support keeps this investigation alive. White heavy checkmark. Some players refused to disappear. They spoke despite the cost. Interviews followed. Headlines surfaced briefly. Then resistance arrived. Legal letters. Warnings disguised as reminders. Consequences framed as policy. Opportunities vanished quietly. Broadcast roles never materialized. Coaching paths closed. Consulting offers evaporated. No explanation was given. None was needed. The message was clear. Loyalty was remembered. Defiance was recorded. Former players learned that the league never forgets, even after careers end. Especially after careers end. Public perception mattered deeply. Heroes could become liabilities overnight. Those who challenged authority were recast as unstable, emotional, untrustworthy. Media repeated the framing. Questions softened. Criticism faded. Time buried the story. The league waited patiently. Outrage always cooled. It always does. And when it did, nothing changed structurally. Those who spoke paid privately. The league continued publicly. Because control does not require force. When influence is already absolute. Legal settlements created silence at scale. Not one voice. Many. Dozens at a time. Each agreement isolated individuals. Prevented collective testimony. Prevented shared narratives. The league understood fragmentation. Together, stories form truth. Separated, they become anecdotes. This strategy proved effective. Public memory is short. Legal language is permanent. The league framed settlements as generosity, as progress, as responsibility. But generosity does not require secrecy, and responsibility does not forbid speech. What was being protected was not dignity, it was exposure. The more players accepted silence, the safer the system became. Whistleblowers became rare, not because harm disappeared, but because resistance felt futile. Even advocates grew tired. Legal battles drained years. Health declined faster than cases resolved. Justice delayed became justice denied. The league relied on time. Time weakens movements. Time exhausts individuals. Time protects institutions. And time proved to be the league's most loyal ally. White heavy checkmark. Behind the scenes, reputation management never stopped. Public relations teams monitored narratives constantly. Trending topics were tracked. Keywords flagged. Stories assessed for threat level. Damage control became routine. Statements were prepared in advance. Apologies avoided. Language softened carefully. Concern expressed without admission. The league framed dissent as emotional reaction, not factual critique. Executives spoke calmly. With data. With distance. Former players spoke from pain. Pain appeared unstable on television. The contrast favored power. Every appearance was calculated. Who spoke? When they spoke. Where they spoke. Access became currency. Those who aligned were rewarded. Those who challenged were excluded. No blacklist existed officially. Unofficially, patterns were obvious. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. Relationships cooled. Silence returned. The league did not need censorship. It had influence. Influence shapes visibility. Visibility shapes truth. And truth, without visibility, loses power. The NFL understood this deeply. It managed narratives as carefully as it managed the game itself. White heavy checkmark families became collateral damage. Spouses watched careers dissolve. Children absorbed tension they couldn't name. Financial stress replaced stability. Medical costs mounted quietly. Promises made during careers vanished afterward. Support programs proved limited. Eligibility rules excluded many. Help required compliance. Criticism jeopardized assistance. Some families chose silence to secure care. Others spoke and lost access. There was no winning choice. Only trade-offs. The league framed benefits as generosity. But generosity does not expire. Support was conditional. And conditions demanded loyalty. Former players learned that criticism carried penalties. Not formal ones, but practical ones. Insurance complications. Delayed approvals. Endless paperwork. The system exhausted people quietly. Resistance requires energy. Energy fades under pressure, especially when health declines. Families shouldered burdens privately. The league remained distant publicly. Expressions of concern remained abstract. Behind every settlement was a family silenced. Behind every quiet retirement was a story untold. And behind every official statement was a calculation. That silence remained the most cost-effective solution. White heavy checkmark. Some journalists tried to push deeper. Investigations surfaced intermittently. Documents leaked. Patterns became harder to deny. But sustained attention proved elusive. Outrage cycles moved quickly. New scandals replaced old ones. The league understood momentum. It waited out storms. It relied on distraction. Big games overshadowed bad headlines. Championships erased controversy. Victory washed away doubt. Fans wanted escape, not reckoning. The league provided spectacle generously. Critical voices were drowned out by noise. Talking heads debated without resolution. False balance blurred truth. The appearance of debate replaced action. Executives rarely faced direct questioning. Press conferences remained controlled. Hard questions went unanswered. Time expired sessions conveniently. The system remained intact. Former players watched change stall. Promises repeated without follow-through. Reforms announced without enforcement. The cycle reset. Public memory faded. Private damage persisted. And the league emerged unscathed again. Because power does not collapse from exposure alone. It collapses from sustained pressure. Pressure the league had learned how to deflect, delay, and ultimately survive. White heavy checkmark. The cost of silence was not theoretical. It showed up in obituaries, in mugshots, in divorce records, in empty homes. Many former players struggled privately. Depression went untreated. Anger went misunderstood. Memory loss went ignored. The league distanced itself carefully. Each case framed as isolated tragedy, never as systemic failure. Personal responsibility became the narrative shield. The game remained untouched. Those who questioned the system were accused of attacking football itself. That accusation carried weight. Football was sacred, untouchable. Criticism felt like betrayal. The league encouraged this framing subtly. It aligned itself with tradition, with patriotism, With community identity, opposition became un-American, ungrateful, disloyal. Former players faced backlash, not just from the league, but from fans, from peers, from their own past. Speaking out isolated them socially. Silence preserved belonging, and belonging often mattered more than justice to those already losing everything else. White heavy checkmark. Some players tried collective action. Unity promised protection, but unity was fragile. Fear fractured alliances. Settlements divided interests. Timing weakened momentum. The league exploited division skillfully. One case resolved quietly. Another delayed indefinitely. Momentum dissolved. Collective outrage faded into individual survival. The league continued adapting. Language evolved. Policies shifted cosmetically. Enough to claim progress, not enough to admit wrongdoing. Independent oversight remained limited. Internal control persisted. True transparency stayed elusive. Because transparency invites accountability, and accountability threatens precedent. The league guarded precedent fiercely. If one truth broke through, others would follow. So pressure was diffused intentionally. Players were treated case by case. Never as a class. Never as a system. Fragmentation preserved control. Those still playing watched carefully. They learned the lesson early. The price of honesty was too high, and silence remained the safer career decision. White heavy checkmark fans rarely saw this side of the league. They saw Sundays. They saw highlights. They saw triumph. Behind that image, control was exercised methodically. The league did not silence voices publicly. It removed platforms quietly. It restricted access subtly. It rewarded alignment generously. Power rarely announces itself. It normalizes itself. Former players learned that resistance required sacrifice, with no guarantee of outcome. Many chose to disappear instead, to rebuild quietly, to survive privately. Their absence created illusion. If no one spoke, nothing was wrong. The league benefited from that assumption. Silence became proof of stability. But silence was never consent. It was survival. And survival under pressure is not evidence of justice. It is evidence of imbalance. An imbalance the league maintained carefully. Because when power goes unchallenged, it does not need force. It needs patience. The truth does not disappear when it is buried. It waits. It accumulates. It surfaces through patterns, through repetition, through consequences that cannot be managed forever. Former players carried fragments of a larger story, individually dismissed, collectively undeniable. The league counted on fragmentation. It counted on exhaustion. It counted on time eroding outrage. And for years it worked. But time also exposes contradictions. Public statements aged poorly. Early denials contradicted later acknowledgments. Medical certainty replaced earlier doubt. What once was impossible became officially recognized. But recognition came without responsibility. Admission without accountability. The league celebrated progress without confronting origin. Reforms focused forward, never backward, never toward those already harmed. Former players watched the narrative shift without inclusion. Their suffering validated rhetorically, but ignored materially. Truth was acknowledged abstractly, never personally, and abstraction protected power. Because systems can apologize broadly, while avoiding reparations entirely. This was not ignorance. It was design. Carefully calibrated, legally informed, emotionally detached, and devastatingly effective. White heavy checkmark silencing does not always require force. Sometimes it requires exhaustion, endless paperwork, delayed responses, ambiguous promises, systems that appear open, but function selectively. Former players learned to navigate mazes. Eligibility criteria changed. Requirements multiplied. Assistance felt conditional. Advocacy felt punished. Those who complied found limited relief. Those who resisted found doors closing. This imbalance shaped behavior quietly. No threats were issued. No ultimatums delivered. Choices were framed as administrative. But outcomes were political. The League maintained plausible deniability. Everything appeared procedural, neutral, fair. But fairness without equity is merely structure, and structure favors those who built it. Former players aged into obscurity. Their stories lost urgency. New generations replaced them. The cycle repeated seamlessly, because the League did not need to erase history. It only needed to outlast it. And outlasting became strategy. A long game played, far from the field. White heavy check mark. This is not a story about bitterness. It is a story about power. About who controls narratives. About who pays the price of silence. The NFL did not silence former players accidentally. It did so systematically. Through law. Through influence. Through selective access. Through time. And through the understanding that institutions rarely face consequences. Without sustained pressure. Former players were not weak. They were constrained. They were isolated. They were outmatched. Their silence was survival, not consent. And survival should never be mistaken for agreement. The truth still exists. It lives in patterns, in documents, in testimonies never aired. Whether it fully emerges depends on attention, on memory, on refusal to accept convenient narratives. This story is not finished. It is ongoing, because as long as silence is rewarded, truth will remain buried. And a league that fears truth reveals more about itself than any whistleblower ever could. The league survives on silence. Truth survives on attention. If you don't want these stories buried, subscribe to Dark Side of the NFL. More investigations are coming. More silence will be challenged. And if this video changed the way you see the game, leave a comment below. Because every conversation is a crack in the system that depends on silence.